They sold my property while I was deployed, signed papers in clean offices while I slept on dirt overseas, and thought the uniform meant I'd never make it back in time. The HOA president, the woman everyone called reasonable in public, decided that military absence meant ownership vacancy. She didn't knock, didn't wait, didn't warn. She just took. By the time I stepped off the transport plane, my land was already carved into lots, permits approved, money moved, signatures dry. HOA Karen believed deployment was the same as disappearance. She believed silence was surrender. She believed soldiers don't come home angry. She was wrong on every count. I didn't discover the sale through a letter or a call. I found out because strangers were measuring my fence line. That was the moment something cold settled in my chest and stayed there. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The man holding the clipboard didn't recognize me, and why would he? Because in his mind, this land already belonged to someone else. He told me to step back because construction was scheduled to begin within the week. He spoke slowly, politely, the way people do when they think you're confused rather than robbed. I asked him who authorized the sale, and he gave me the HOA name like it was a government agency instead of a neighborhood cartel with bylaws and teeth. My name wasn't on his paperwork anymore. My grandfather's name wasn't either. According to the documents taped to the survey stakes, the land had been foreclosed, reassigned, and approved for subdivision while I was serving overseas. HOA Karen's signature sat neatly at the bottom of every page, looping and confident, the handwriting of someone who had never been challenged in her life. I stood there in uniform, boots still dusty from deployment, staring at survey flags stuck into soil my family had owned longer than the HOA had existed. Every instinct I'd trained screamed to stay calm, assess, don't escalate. But this wasn't a battlefield with rules written down. This was theft, wrapped in procedure. HOA. Karen hadn't taken my property with force. She took it with meetings, notices mailed to an empty house, votes held while I was unreachable, and a foreclosure clock timed perfectly to my absence. She used my service against me, weaponized my deployment, and bet everything on the idea that I'd come home too tired or too broke to fight back. When I went to the HOA office the next morning, the receptionist smiled like nothing was wrong. She told me I needed an appointment. I told her I needed my land. She disappeared into the back and returned with HOA Karen herself, pearls at her throat, posture straight, expression calm in that practiced way people use when they think authority protects them from consequences. She thanked me for my service and then told me the sale was legal, final, and already closed. She said the community couldn't wait on absent owners, and that rules applied equally to everyone. She said unpaid assessments and covenant violations justified foreclosure. She said all of this without raising her voice because she didn't need to. She believed the paperwork had already won. I asked her why none of the notices had reached me overseas. She said that wasn't her responsibility. I asked her why my wife's objections had been ignored. She said the board had voted. I asked her how a few $100s in disputed fines turned into a complete property seizure. She smiled and said that was how enforcement worked. That smile is something I still remember clearly, because it wasn't cruel, it was satisfied. HOA. Karen wasn't angry or defensive. She was proud that she had pulled it off, proud that she had outplayed someone she considered temporary. What she didn't understand was that deployment teaches you patience, not weakness. It teaches you how to wait, how to watch patterns, how to document everything because memory alone never wins a fight. While she thought I was adjusting back to civilian life, I was pulling records, requesting certified copies, tracing timelines, and reading every line of the Service Members Civil Relief Act she thought she'd sidestepped. Every signature she relied on became another thread to pull. Every rushed approval became another question she couldn't answer without lying. The shock wasn't just that my land was gone, it was how casually it had been taken. HOA. Karen didn't see herself as a thief. She saw herself as efficient. She didn't think she was abusing power. She thought she was exercising it. That arrogance is what made her sloppy. She assumed the uniform meant compliance, that military discipline meant quiet acceptance. She assumed I'd be grateful for an explanation instead of furious at the betrayal. Standing there at the edge of my own property, watching surveyors plan how to erase it, I made a decision that didn't feel dramatic in the moment but changed everything after. I wasn't going to argue with her in the hallway. I wasn't going to beg a board that had already voted me out. I wasn't going to threaten lawsuits I didn't fully understand yet. I was going to let HOA Karen finish what she started, because the more complete her theft became, the clearer her crime would be. She thought speed protected her. She thought completion meant safety. She didn't realize that every house she approved, every lot she sold, every dollar she moved while I was deployed made the reversal bigger, louder, and impossible to hide. She believed the system only moved one direction. She never considered what happens when the system meets someone trained to reverse momentum. By the time she realized I wasn't going away, it was already too late to undo anything quietly. The subdivision plans were public. The buyers were lined up. The paperwork trail was locked in. And the military protections she dismissed as technicalities were about to become the center of a very real intervention. HOA Karen thought she had erased me from the land. What she actually did was give me jurisdiction, leverage, and a reason to bring forces she couldn't vote against. That was the beginning of the end, even though she didn't know it yet. Before HOA Karen ever put her name on a foreclosure document, before she learned how to smile while stealing, this land already had a history written into it that no board vote could erase. My authority didn't come from rank or uniform, it came from continuity. This property wasn't a speculative purchase or a vacation lot. It was inherited responsibility, passed down with stories and boundaries instead of contracts alone. My grandfather bought it when the surrounding area was nothing but open ground and fence lines, long before anyone dreamed of gated entrances or compliance committees. He built the first structures himself, set the water access, recorded the surveys correctly, and never joined the HOA when it later wrapped around his land like a net. He understood something HOA Karen never did, that land ownership isn't just possession, it's memory backed by documentation. When I inherited the property, I didn't change anything because nothing needed changing. I paid the taxes, maintained the structures, kept the land exactly as it had been kept for decades. The HOA existed nearby, but it had no authority over my parcel, and that frustrated Karen from the moment she realized it. She didn't like exceptions. She didn't like owners who didn't need her approval. She especially didn't like a property that sat inside her imagined kingdom, but answered to no one on her board. Long before I deployed, she had already tried to fold my land into her control through fines, courtesy notices, and invented violations that carried no legal weight. Each time, they failed because the law was clear and the records were older than her bylaws. My deployment didn't erase that history, but it created a window she was waiting for. While I was overseas, she reframed absence as abandonment, routine maintenance as neglect, and legal independence as defiance. She mailed notices she knew wouldn't reach me, scheduled hearings she knew I couldn't attend, and created a paper trail designed to look fair to anyone who didn't bother reading closely. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was preparation. Every assessment she levied during that period was calculated, not random. Every deadline was timed to my silence. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was building a case file meant to survive a cursory glance. What she underestimated was the authority that comes from service, not as a social shield, but as a legal condition. Deployment doesn't suspend ownership, it enhances protection. The Service Members Civil Relief Act exists precisely because people like HOA Karen have always tried to exploit absence. It freezes foreclosure actions, voids predatory sales, and places a heavy burden of proof on anyone claiming necessity. She either didn't understand it or thought she could slip through it by hiding behind procedural noise. Either way, she acted as if military law was optional, something that only mattered if someone complained loudly enough. My wife didn't stay quiet. She documented everything, attended meetings, objected in writing, and flagged the deployment status repeatedly. Those objections didn't disappear, they were ignored, and that distinction matters. Ignored objections aren't mistakes, they're evidence. Every email she sent, every certified letter she submitted, every meeting minute that recorded her presence while dismissing her concerns added weight to what would later become a clear pattern of willful violation. HOA Karen wasn't confused about my status. She acknowledged it and moved forward anyway. Authority isn't volume, it's alignment with law, and by the time I returned, the alignment was unmistakable. The property had been sold in direct conflict with federal protections, using a process designed to look legitimate while bypassing mandatory safeguards. Karen relied on the assumption that challenging it would be too complex, too expensive, or too intimidating for a single homeowner. She assumed the uniform meant obedience, not escalation. She never considered that military authority doesn't end at the gate. It expands when laws meant to protect service members are violated. By the time I finished reconstructing the timeline, pulling records from the county, matching them against deployment orders, and cross-referencing HOA communications, the picture was complete. This wasn't a gray area. This was a straight line from intent to execution. My authority didn't need to be asserted loudly, because it already existed on paper, backed by statutes she chose to ignore. And once authority is established, the next step isn't argument, it's enforcement. That was the point where the story stopped being about a stolen property and started becoming something HOA Karen could no longer control, because authority backed by law doesn't negotiate with people who thought they were untouchable. HOA Karen didn't rule through chaos, she ruled through structure, and that was what made her dangerous. She understood that power doesn't need to be loud if it's procedural. Every abuse she committed was wrapped in process, stamped with letterhead, and buried under enough paperwork that most people surrendered before reaching the bottom. The board wasn't a collection of equals. It was an echo chamber she engineered over time. She selected members who either owed her favors, feared retaliation, or benefited quietly from her control. Meetings were formal performances where outcomes were decided before the first gavel strike, and dissent was treated like a behavioral issue instead of a legal one. The HOA's enforcement arm existed less to maintain standards and more to condition compliance. Violations were inconsistently applied, escalating only against homeowners who questioned authority or resisted suggestions. Fines appeared suddenly, multiplied without explanation, and were framed as opportunities for correction rather than punishment, even as interest accrued and deadlines shrank. Karen relied on exhaustion as a tactic. She knew most people had jobs, families, and limited patience for drawn-out disputes, so she turned enforcement into attrition. The longer someone resisted, the more expensive resistance became. Communication followed the same pattern. Notices were sent in ways that maximized technical compliance while minimizing actual receipt. Certified letters were posted with insufficient time to respond. Digital portals were updated without alerts. Meeting minutes omitted objections or summarized them in ways that stripped context. When challenged, Karen hid behind the collective, insisting decisions were made by vote, while ensuring votes were predetermined. Responsibility dissolved upward, and accountability vanished downward, leaving homeowners trapped in a system designed to protect itself first. Financial opacity was another lever. Budgets were dense, reserves vaguely defined, and expenditures justified through broad categories that discouraged scrutiny. Requests for clarification were labeled disruptive. Audits were delayed or conducted internally. Anyone who pushed too hard found themselves suddenly subject to heightened enforcement, as if curiosity itself violated community standards. Karen framed this as order, but it functioned as control, ensuring no one could see the full picture without risking personal consequences. What made the abuse sustainable was normalization. Over time, residents adjusted expectations downward. They stopped asking why fines differed, why rules changed, why certain properties were untouched. Fear didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated quietly. By the time my property became a target, the machinery was already well-oiled, accustomed to operating without resistance. Karen didn't invent the HOA's authority. She weaponized it, turning bylaws into tools of leverage rather than governance. When I was deployed, that structure shifted into overdrive. My absence removed a variable she couldn't predict, and she moved quickly to exploit it. Enforcement accelerated, documentation thickened, and procedural steps were stacked tightly enough to resemble inevitability. To anyone unfamiliar with the details, it looked like routine administration. To anyone paying attention, it was a coordinated squeeze designed to force a default she could then justify as community protection. The abuse wasn't emotional, it was systematic. It didn't rely on shouting or threats. It relied on process fatigue and assumed power. Karen believed that if she followed the outline of authority closely enough, the substance wouldn't matter. She mistook procedure for immunity, and that mistake was about to expose every weakness in the structure she thought was unassailable. The moment I stopped reacting emotionally and started reconstructing events chronologically, HOA Karen's entire operation began to unravel. Abuse survives in noise, but it collapses under sequencing. I pulled every document in existence, county records, HOA notices, payment histories, lien filings, board minutes, and deployment orders, and laid them out in strict order. Not the order Karen wanted people to see, but the order reality enforced. Once everything was aligned by date and action, the pattern stopped looking accidental and started looking intentional, because intent leaves fingerprints when you slow time down. The first crack appeared in the foreclosure timeline. The HOA claimed the process began due to unpaid assessments, yet the payment ledger showed inconsistencies that couldn't be reconciled with their own rules. Charges appeared after deadlines that had already passed. Interest was applied before notices were sent. Certain fines referenced bylaws that weren't adopted until months later. That wasn't sloppiness. It was retroactive justification. Karen wasn't enforcing existing rules. She was manufacturing compliance history to support an outcome she'd already decided on. Then came the deployment overlap. My orders were public record, time-stamped, and indisputable. Under federal law, foreclosure actions against deployed service members require court approval, explicit findings, and verified notice. None of that existed. Instead, the HOA substituted internal board approval and labeled it sufficient authority. Karen's signature appeared on documents certifying compliance with protections she never actually followed. That single misrepresentation transformed a civil dispute into a federal violation, because once you attest to compliance falsely, you're no longer operating in a gray area. The sale itself was worse. The property transfer was recorded under an entity linked directly to Karen, not a third-party buyer. That eliminated any pretense of neutrality. She didn't just enforce a foreclosure, she positioned herself to benefit from it. The deed trail showed an immediate internal transfer, followed by preparations to subdivide and integrate the land into the HOA's controlled assets. This wasn't about settling a debt. It was about acquisition under cover of enforcement. Email records completed the picture. Messages between board members revealed discussions about timing, absence, and limited resistance. No one referenced compliance with military protections except to question whether they applied if no one objects in time. That phrase alone destroyed any defense of ignorance. They weren't unsure, they were gambling. Karen framed risk as acceptable if the homeowner was unlikely to respond quickly enough. That's not governance, it's opportunism. Witness statements reinforced it. My wife's objections were logged, acknowledged, and ignored. Staff confirmed instructions to proceed regardless of deployment status. Contractors discussed future plans for the land before the sale was even finalized. Everything pointed in one direction, forward, because Karen never planned for scrutiny. She planned for surrender. Her mistake was assuming the record would stay fragmented, that no one would assemble it end to end. Proof doesn't need drama, it needs coherence. Once the documents spoke to each other, they told a single story, and it wasn't the one Karen had been selling. The HOA hadn't enforced rules. It had exploited absence. It hadn't followed procedure. It had simulated it. And the deeper I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a model she'd used before, refined through repetition. By the time the file was complete, there was nothing left to argue about. The evidence didn't rely on interpretation. It relied on alignment. Dates, signatures, transfers, and omissions lined up in a way that made denial impossible. HOA Karen's authority evaporated the moment proof replaced assumption, because systems built on intimidation collapse when confronted with documentation they never expected anyone to read in full. The confrontation didn't begin in a courtroom or behind closed doors. It began the moment the evidence left my hands and entered systems. HOA Karen could no longer intimidate. Authority shifts fast when enforcement replaces argument. Once the military protections were formally invoked and the documentation packet was forwarded through the proper channels, the tone changed everywhere at once. Phone calls that had gone unanswered were returned immediately. Emails that once received templated responses were suddenly escalated. Karen's confidence didn't vanish instantly, but it fractured, and cracks in her control started showing in public. The first collapse came at the HOA meeting she didn't cancel in time. She thought she could manage the narrative, thought she could frame the issue as a technical dispute blown out of proportion. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly fear dissolves when people realize the enforcer is under scrutiny. Homeowners showed up who hadn't attended meetings in years. Questions were asked on record. Financials were demanded. When Karen tried to deflect, her usual tactics failed because the room was no longer isolated. Everyone knew outside authorities were watching. The protection she had relied on, silence, was gone. Then came the notice. The foreclosure was formally challenged and flagged under federal statute, triggering an immediate review. The sale was frozen, the deed clouded, and the HOA's authority over the property suspended pending outcome. That single action sent shockwaves through the subdivision because it exposed the truth residents had long suspected, but never confirmed, that Karen's power only existed as long as no one higher looked too closely. Once they did, everything slowed to a crawl, and in that pause, her empire started collapsing under its own weight. Media attention followed naturally. Public records don't stay quiet when military protections are violated. Reporters didn't need embellishment. They needed timelines, and the timeline was airtight. Questions shifted from, "Why is this homeowner upset?" to, "How did an HOA bypass federal law?" Karen's name stopped being associated with community standards and started being associated with risk. Sponsors pulled back. Vendors stopped returning calls. Board members who had once voted with her suddenly claimed ignorance or absence. Loyalty evaporated faster than authority ever could. The most damaging moment wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. The temporary receiver was appointed to oversee HOA operations, while investigations continued. That appointment stripped Karen of functional control, without removing her title immediately, a limbo she wasn't equipped to survive. She could no longer issue fines, approve expenditures, or direct enforcement. Everything she had used to command obedience was paused, and without those tools, she was just another board member with a reputation problem. The silence that followed was louder than any confrontation could have been. Residents started speaking openly. Past fines were questioned. Old disputes resurfaced. Patterns emerged publicly, not as rumor, but as corroborated experiences. What Karen had kept compartmentalized through individual intimidation became collective knowledge. Each story reinforced the next, and the narrative solidified into something she couldn't spin. This wasn't one angry owner. It was a systemic abuse finally exposed. By the time the formal hearing arrived, the outcome was already clear. The sale was voided. The foreclosure declared unlawful. The HOA's actions were condemned in language that left no room for reinterpretation. Karen's authority didn't end with a bang. It ended with a record, and records don't forget. Her name became synonymous with overreach, her methods a cautionary example, and her subdivision a case study in what happens when private power forgets its limits. The collapse was total because it was public. HOA Karen didn't just lose control of my property. She lost the illusion that she had ever controlled the law. Once the collapse became unavoidable, HOA Karen tried to reassert control the only way she knew how, through retaliation disguised as expertise. She leaned on consultants, hired specialists, and brought in professionals whose job wasn't to solve the problem but to muddy it. Lawyers issued statements filled with conditional language. Compliance experts reframed violations as interpretive differences. Accounting firms suddenly appeared with summaries meant to reassure rather than explain. Karen believed that if she surrounded herself with credentials, authority would return by association. She was wrong. The experts she relied on expected a private dispute, not a documented federal violation. Once they realized the scope of exposure, their posture changed. They stopped advocating and started insulating themselves. Advice became cautious. Opinions were hedged. Karen noticed the shift, but misunderstood it. She thought they were preparing a stronger defense, when in reality they were preparing exit strategies. Experts don't go down with clients who ignored warnings, and the deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that Karen hadn't just crossed lines, she'd erased them. Retaliation escalated in subtler ways. Access to common amenities was restricted under the guise of maintenance. Notices were sent warning residents against speculation and outside interference. Attempts were made to portray the unfolding investigation as disruptive rather than corrective. Karen tried to weaponize community fatigue, hoping people would resent the scrutiny more than the abuse that caused it. But once experts began contradicting her privately, leaks became inevitable. Whispers turned into confirmations. Documents appeared that hadn't been disclosed before. The retaliation campaign collapsed under its own contradictions. The military response was precise, not emotional. Legal advisors coordinated with civilian authorities to ensure the reversal wasn't just symbolic, but enforceable. Orders were issued clarifying jurisdiction, reaffirming protections, and outlining consequences for continued interference. Karen's experts couldn't counter that. Military law doesn't debate intent. It enforces compliance. Every retaliatory action she took after formal notice only compounded her liability. Each email, each restriction, each attempt to intimidate became an additional data point, not leverage. What Karen never understood was that expertise doesn't create power, it reveals limits. The more professionals became involved, the clearer her isolation became. Advisors stopped returning calls promptly. Meetings were postponed. Reports softened. Eventually, silence replaced strategy. The retaliation phase ended not with escalation, but with abandonment. Karen had exhausted her usefulness as a client, and experts protect themselves first. By the time enforcement actions resumed, there was no coordinated resistance left. The experts had stepped back, the advisors had disengaged, and the narrative was no longer hers to influence. Retaliation failed because it relied on fear, and fear evaporates when authority is reclaimed by institutions designed to outlast individuals. Karen's final mistake was believing she could outmaneuver systems built specifically to prevent exactly what she had done. When expertise withdrew, enforcement advanced, and there was nothing left between her and the consequences except the record she had written herself. The victory didn't arrive with celebration or relief, it arrived with finality. The property was restored without conditions, without negotiation, without apology. The deed returned to its rightful status as if the illegal sale had never existed, not because anyone felt generous, but because the law required correction. HOA Karen wasn't present when it happened. She didn't get a final speech, a rebuttal, or a chance to reframe the outcome. Authority doesn't announce itself when it's finished. It simply records the result and moves on. The subdivision changed overnight, not physically, but psychologically. The gates still stood. The roads still curved the same way, but the atmosphere shifted. Enforcement notices stopped appearing. Meetings became quieter, shorter, procedural. People stopped lowering their voices when talking about the board. Karen's name disappeared from correspondence, then from agendas, then from memory. Power doesn't linger once it's exposed as artificial. It dissolves the moment people realize it was never absolute. The HOA survived, but it survived smaller. Its reach narrowed, its tone softened. Oversight replaced intimidation. External audits became routine instead of resisted. The structure Karen had built to dominate was dismantled piece by piece, not out of revenge, but necessity. Systems that fail publicly don't get rebuilt the same way. They get constrained. The subdivision learned, slowly and permanently, that authority borrowed without accountability always comes due. As for Karen, there was no dramatic fall from grace, only silence. No more emails, no more directives, no more presence. She didn't argue the outcome because there was nothing left to argue. The record was complete. The reversal was total. Her strategy collapsed under scrutiny, and once exposed, it couldn't be reused, renamed, or repackaged. She didn't lose because someone outplayed her emotionally. She lost because she violated rules that don't bend for convenience. I returned to the property without ceremony. The land was the same as it had always been, unchanged by paperwork or conflict. Ownership doesn't feel triumphant when it's restored. It feels normal, and that normalcy is the point. The system corrected itself, not because it cared about me personally, but because it was forced to acknowledge what should never have been questioned in the first place. No speeches followed, no lessons were offered. The gates opened when they were ordered to. The files closed when they were finalized. HOA Karen went quiet.